The iPad's screen glowed on the kitchen counter like evidence at a crime scene, which, Margaret would later realize, was exactly what it was. She'd been wiping down the granite countertop after Tuesday's book club, the lingering scent of Eleanor's cigarettes still clinging to the curtains despite the no-smoking rule, when Robert's forgotten tablet chimed with a text message. The preview floated across the lock screen for just 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds shattered 30 years of marriage like a hammer through glass. Can't wait for Thursday at the club. Wear that blue dress I love. L. Margaret's hand froze mid-wipe, the damp dishcloth dripping onto her house slippers, the worn pair Robert always mocked. Her first thought wasn't rage or heartbreak. It was confusion. Robert didn't belong to any club. He'd turned down country club memberships 3 times, claiming they couldn't afford it on his insurance agency salary, not with 3 kids' college tuitions behind them and retirement ahead. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times. A wedding gift from Robert's mother, who'd died, convinced Margaret wasn't good enough for her son. Maybe she'd been right all along. Margaret set down the dishcloth with the deliberate care of someone handling explosives. The iPad screen had gone dark, but that message burned behind her eyelids. That single L sparked across her mind like a lit fuse, and she already knew exactly who L was. Her phone sat charging on the kitchen desk, right next to the church directory she'd been updating for Pastor Williams. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled to Linda Chen's contact. There was her friend's smiling face, taken at last year's church picnic. Linda's arm was around Margaret's shoulders, both of them laughing at something Robert had said. Margaret couldn't remember the joke anymore. The blue dress. Linda had a blue dress, that expensive wrap dress from Nordstrom she'd bought after the divorce was finalized. She'd modeled it for Margaret over lunch at Panera, spinning like a teenager, saying she needed to reclaim her sexuality after James's betrayal. Margaret had encouraged her, had held Linda while she sobbed about being replaced by a younger woman, had spent countless evenings assuring her friend that she was beautiful, desirable, worthy of love. The iPad chimed again. Margaret's chest tightened, her breath coming in short gasps that reminded her of her first panic attack during Mom's chemo treatments 6 months ago. She gripped the counter's edge, focusing on the cold granite under her palms, grounding herself the way the grief counselor had taught her. 10 breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth. On breath 7, she reached for the iPad. Robert's passcode hadn't changed in 5 years, 0602, his birthday, because he could never remember anything more complex. The device unlocked, revealing a cascade of messages that made Margaret's knees buckle. She sank onto the kitchen stool, the one with the wobbly leg Robert kept promising to fix, and scrolled up and up and up. 6 months of messages, 6 months of missing you, and can't wait to hold you, and Margaret doesn't understand me like you do. The timeline made her stomach lurch. Each first message was dated April 3rd, 2 days after Mom's diagnosis, when Margaret had been too shattered to notice anything beyond the oncologist's gentle voice explaining treatment options. I know this is wrong, Linda had written that first time, but I've loved you since the day I introduced you to. I just wanted Margaret to be happy. Margaret laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that startled Whiskers from his nap on the windowsill. The tabby cat regarded her with concern before padding over to rub against her legs, purring with an intensity reserved for moments when his humans needed comfort. She wanted me to be happy, Margaret told the cat, her voice strange and hollow in the empty kitchen. 30 years, Whiskers. 30 years of dinner parties and birthday celebrations, and her son's graduations and my mother's funeral, and she wanted me to be happy. The messages grew more bold as she scrolled, meeting locations, always the Westlake Reserve Country Club where Linda maintained her membership post-divorce. Times when Margaret was at her mother's treatments, at the lawyer's office handling the estate, at the grocery store buying Robert's favorite pot roast ingredients. Margaret's making your favorite tonight, one message from Robert read. She has no idea I'll be tasting your lips while eating it. The dishcloth's dampness had spread across the counter, pooling near the coffee maker Robert insisted on upgrading last Christmas. Margaret watched the water creep toward the iPad, making no move to stop it. Let it all drown, she thought. Let it all short-circuit and burn. But then her practical nature, the nurse's training that never fully left, kicked in. Evidence. She needed evidence. Not for divorce proceedings, not yet, but for herself. For the moments in the coming days when she'd try to convince herself this was all a misunderstanding, a nightmare, a mistake. She grabbed her reading glasses from their chain around her neck, the ones Robert said aged her 10 years, and began taking screenshots. Each image saved with a soft click that sounded like bones breaking. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Document everything, sweetheart. Memory fails, but paper trails don't. Mom had been talking about medical records, about keeping track of medications and treatments, but the advice fit here too, in this kitchen that suddenly felt like a stranger's home. The front door's lock turned, Robert's key scraping the way it always did when he was distracted by his phone. Margaret's body moved on autopilot, closing the iPad, placing it exactly where she'd found it, dropping the dishcloth over the water puddle. By the time Robert entered the kitchen, she was at the sink, washing the already clean coffee mugs from book club. "Smells like cigarettes in here," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door despite her 1,000 requests to use the hall closet. "I thought you had a no-smoking rule?" "Eleanor." Margaret was surprised by how normal her voice sounded. 30 years of marriage had taught her to hide many things: disappointment, exhaustion, dreams deferred, but never betrayal of this magnitude. Robert grunted, already scrolling through his phone. He looked the same as he had this morning, gray suit slightly wrinkled, red tie she'd given him for his birthday loosened at the throat, hair thinning at the crown where he carefully combed it over. When had she stopped really seeing him? When had he become just another fixture in the house, like the grandfather clock or the kitchen stool with the wobbly leg? "Linda called earlier," he said casually, opening the refrigerator to peer inside. "Wanted to know if we're free Thursday night." "Some charity thing at the club. I told her we'd check our calendars." The lie slid from his mouth as easily as olive oil from a bottle. Margaret turned off the water, dried her hands on the dish towel, the one with the rooster pattern her mother had loved, and faced her husband. "Thursday? I have grief counseling Thursday." "Right." He didn't look up from the leftover containers. "Well, maybe I'll just pop by myself." "Show support for Linda. She's been lonely since the divorce." Margaret's laugh threatened to escape again, that sharp, bitter sound that belonged to a woman she didn't recognize. She swallowed it, tasting acid. "That's thoughtful of you." He finally looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, concern, or just annoyance that dinner wasn't ready. After 3 decades, she couldn't read him anymore. Maybe she never could. "You okay?" "You look pale." "Just tired." "Mom's estate paperwork is more complicated than I expected." The mention of money sparked his interest as she knew it would. "The lawyer says everything's on track though, right? Should have the inheritance transferred by end of month?" "Yes, Robert. End of month." He nodded, satisfied, and pulled out the container of leftover pot roast. "I'll heat this up." "You should rest. You've been running yourself ragged lately." The concern in his voice might have touched her yesterday. Today, it made her skin crawl. She watched him move around the kitchen, her kitchen, the one she'd painted yellow against his wishes, the one where she'd taught their children to cook, where she'd canned preserves with his mother despite their mutual dislike, where she'd sobbed quietly after Mom's diagnosis while Robert slept upstairs. "I think I will lie down," she said. "I have a headache." Upstairs in their bedroom, when had she started thinking of it as their bedroom instead of hers? Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out her phone. Her sister's contact photo smiled back, tan and happy from her Florida retirement community. Diane answered on the second ring. "Maggie? Everything okay? It's past your usual calling time." Margaret opened her mouth to tell her sister everything, but what came out was, did Mom ever mention anything about infidelity? In her marriage to Dad? Silence stretched across the 1,000 miles between Ohio and Florida. "Why are you asking?" I've been going through her things. Found some old letters. Just wondering. Diane sighed. She suspected once. Told me Dad had been acting strange, coming home late, being extra sweet, but she never found proof, and eventually things went back to normal. She said sometimes it's better not to know for sure. Why? Did you find something? No, Margaret lied. Just old love letters from before they married. Made me nostalgic. They chatted for a few more minutes about nothing. Diane's water aerobics class, the humidity in Sarasota, whether Margaret would visit for Thanksgiving. Normal sister conversation that felt like acting in a play she no longer understood. After hanging up, Margaret lay back on the bed, still in her house dress, still wearing her reading glasses on their chain. The bedroom ceiling had a water stain shaped like a rabbit, from when the upstairs bathroom had leaked 3 years ago. Robert had promised to repaint, but never had. She thought about her mother's suspicions, about choosing not to know for sure. But Mom hadn't had an iPad glowing with evidence on her kitchen counter. Mom hadn't had her best friend's betrayal served up in digital clarity. Mom had been able to choose ignorance. Margaret didn't have that luxury. Her phone buzzed with a text. Linda. Hey, hon, book club was fun today. Sorry about Eleanor and the cigarettes. Want to grab coffee tomorrow? I have something exciting to share. Oufoe? Margaret stared at the heart emoji until her eyes burned. 30 years ago, Linda had grabbed her arm at that church potluck, dragged her across the fellowship hall to meet the most eligible bachelor in the congregation. Margaret had been new to town, starting her nursing job at Cleveland Clinic, knowing nobody. Linda had been her first friend, her best friend, her sister by choice. You two are perfect for each other, Linda had gushed that day, her dark eyes sparkling with matchmaker's pride. Trust me, I have a feeling about these things. Margaret typed back, Coffee sounds great. Usual place at 10? Perfect. Can't wait to see you. Yee. 2 heart emojis now. Margaret wondered if Linda used them in her messages to Robert, too. She'd check the iPad later, after Robert fell asleep watching the news in his recliner, snoring with his mouth open, looking nothing like the charming insurance salesman who'd courted her with grocery store flowers and promises of a secure future. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times. In 2 hours, Robert would be asleep. In 14 hours, she'd be sitting across from Linda at their usual corner table at Panera, the one by the window where Linda liked to people watch and gossip about their church friends' marriages. Margaret closed her eyes and saw that blue wrap dress, the one that cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe. She wondered if Robert had unzipped it, if his hands, the ones that hadn't touched her in months, had traced Linda's skin. The thought should have brought rage, but all she felt was a cold, spreading numbness, like when they'd put the epidural in before her C-section with Tommy. From downstairs came the sound of the microwave beeping, Robert's fork scraping against a plate, the television turning on to Fox News. The sounds of a 30-year marriage continuing on autopilot while its engine had already seized. Margaret rolled onto her side, still in her clothes, still wearing her shoes. Whiskers jumped onto the bed, curling against her stomach, purring his anxious comfort. She stroked his fur absently, her wedding ring catching the light from the hallway. The ring had been Robert's grandmother's, a small diamond in a white gold setting, old-fashioned even 30 years ago. Linda had helped him pick out the wedding band to match it, had stood beside Margaret as maid of honor, had caught the bouquet and joked about being next. She had been next. Married James a year later in a lavish ceremony at the country club, Margaret as her matron of honor, both of them giddy with young love and possibility. Now James was in Chicago with a new wife 15 years younger, and Linda was texting Margaret's husband about blue dresses. The grandfather clock chimed 9, 1 more hour. Margaret thought about the $175,000 sitting in probate, her mother's final gift. Robert had already made plans for it, paying off the mortgage, investing in his agency, maybe finally joining that country club. He'd presented each idea as though Margaret's agreement was assumed, as though the money wasn't solely hers, left specifically to her in Mom's will with language the lawyer said was ironclad. For my daughter, Margaret alone, to secure her independence. Mom had known something. Somehow she'd known. The microwave beeped again downstairs. Robert heating up dessert, the apple pie Margaret had baked yesterday for the book club, before Eleanor chain-smoked through their discussion of Where the Crawdads Sing, before the iPad changed everything, before 30 years revealed themselves as a long, elaborate lie. Margaret sat up, removed her glasses, walked to her closet. Behind her winter coats, wrapped in tissue paper, hung the dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral. Black, simple, appropriate. She'd be wearing it again soon, she realized. Not for another death, but for the funeral of her marriage, her friendship, her old life. But not yet. First, she needed to know everything. Every meeting, every lie, every moment when she'd been worrying about her mother's pain medication while her husband and best friend were. She couldn't finish the thought. The clock chimed 10. Downstairs, Robert's recliner creaked as it extended fully. In minutes, he'd be snoring. In 8 hours, she'd face Linda over coffee and perform the role of oblivious friend one more time. Margaret pulled out her phone and began making a list. Not a grocery list or a chore list or a Christmas gift list. She'd made thousands of those over the years. This was different. This was a battle plan. At the top, she wrote, evidence. Below that, lawyer, then money. And finally, though her hand shook, writing it, revenge. The word looked foreign on her phone screen, like something a stranger would write. Margaret Louise Hayes, née Wilson, devoted wife and mother, registered nurse, retired, church volunteer, maker of pot roasts and apple pies, was not a person who sought revenge. But that woman had died at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, killed by a text message on a forgotten iPad. The woman who remained, well, she was someone new. Someone with her mother's inheritance and her grandmother's steel spine and 30 years of suppressed anger finally given a target. Whiskers meowed, demanding attention. Margaret scratched behind his ears, feeling the rumble of his purr. "It's okay, baby," she whispered to the cat. "Everything's going to be just fine." Downstairs, Robert's snoring had begun, rhythmic and deep. Margaret stood, smoothed her house dress, and walked to the door. She had an iPad to check, screenshots to take, evidence to gather. Thursday at the country club, Linda in her blue dress, Robert in his lying mouth and wandering hands. Margaret smiled, an expression that would have frightened anyone who'd known the old Margaret. 3 days to prepare, 3 days to plan, 3 days until the beginning of the end. Margaret sat in her parked Camry outside Panera Bread, watching Linda's white Mercedes pull into the handicapped space without a permit. A small crime that would have meant nothing yesterday, but today felt like evidence of character. 10 weeks had passed since that Tuesday discovery. 10 weeks of screenshots, saved receipts, documented lies. The coffee meetings had become intelligence operations, each friendly lunch a mission to extract information without revealing her hand. Margaret had discovered she possessed a talent for deception that 30 years of honest living had never revealed. "There you are!" Linda swooped in for a hug, enveloping Margaret in cloud by Ariana Grande, a perfume too young for a woman pushing 60, but then everything about Linda's post-divorce life seemed desperately young. "You look tired, hun. Is it your mother's estate? I know how draining that can be." Margaret allowed the embrace, noting the new tennis bracelet on Linda's wrist. She'd seen the credit card charge on Robert's business American Express, $3,200 at Jared Jewelers, justified as a client gift in his expense reports. Margaret had photographed that receipt 2 days ago while Robert showered, his phone charging carelessly on the dresser. "The estate's almost settled." "Should have the money transferred next week." Linda's eyes brightened with an interest she tried to mask. "That's wonderful. You deserve something good after everything you've been through." They ordered at the counter, Linda's usual salad with dressing on the side, Margaret's soup and sandwich combo. The same orders they'd placed for 15 years of Wednesday coffees, though Margaret now noticed Linda had upgraded from water to a large green tea latte, small extravagances that Robert was apparently funding. At their corner table, Linda launched into her usual chatter about the country club social scene, each story a subtle reminder of the world Margaret couldn't access. But today, Margaret had come prepared. "Actually, I've been thinking about joining," Margaret said, stirring her soup slowly. "With Mom's inheritance, I could finally afford it." Linda's face went through a series of micro-expressions, surprise, panic, forced enthusiasm, that would have been invisible to the old Margaret. The new Margaret catalogued each one. "Oh, that would be amazing. We could play tennis together." "You know I don't play tennis, Linda." "Right, of course. But there's the pool, and the restaurant is divine." And she stopped, reorganizing her thoughts like shuffled cards. "It's quite expensive, though. The initiation fee alone is $15,000. $17,500, Margaret corrected. "I called yesterday." Linda's laugh tinkled like broken glass. "You really have been thinking about it. Robert must be thrilled." "I haven't told him yet. Wanted it to be a surprise." The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Linda fidgeted with her tennis bracelet. Definitely new, definitely expensive, definitely from Robert. Margaret had found the receipt, but seeing it on Linda's wrist transformed evidence into weapon. "That's a beautiful bracelet." "New?" Linda's hand jerked. "This? Oh, just a little treat to myself. Post-divorce therapy, you know. Dr. Morrison says I need to practice self-love." "Dr. Morrison?" Margaret had looked him up. $400 per session, not covered by Linda's insurance. She wondered if Robert was funding that too, labeling it as some business expense. Strategic consulting, perhaps. Client relations. "Speaking of treats," Linda continued, her voice artificially bright, "I have some exciting news. Remember that charity gala I mentioned? The one for the Children's Hospital? Thursday's event?" "Yes." "Well, I've been asked to co-chair it with Robert. Isn't that wonderful? He's been so generous with his corporate donations. The hospital board specifically requested him." Margaret's soup spoon didn't waver. "How thoughtful of him." He didn't mention it. "Oh, he probably didn't want to make a fuss. You know how modest he is about his charity work." Modest. Robert, who once had a trophy made for winning a neighborhood barbecue contest. Robert, who framed every Salesman of the Month certificate from 1995 onward. That Robert was modest about his charity work. "Will spouses be invited?" Margaret asked. Linda's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush creeping up her neck. "It's more of a working event. Very boring, really. Lots of speeches about tax-deductible donations and capital campaigns. You'd hate it." "Probably," Margaret agreed. "I'll be at grief counseling anyway." "Still going to those?" "It's been 6 months, hon. Maybe it's time to move forward." Move forward. Like Linda had moved forward from her 20-year marriage straight into Margaret's 30-year one. Like Robert had moved forward from his wedding vows into Linda's new condo, the one Margaret had helped her decorate after the divorce, picking out throw pillows and curtains, not knowing she was furnishing her husband's love nest. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from James Chen, Linda's ex-husband. "Can we talk? Found those documents you asked about." She'd reached out to James 2 weeks ago, ostensibly about a charity fund his company supported, actually about the real reason his marriage ended. He'd been cagey at first, bound by the non-disclosure agreement Linda's lawyer had demanded. But Margaret had learned that wronged spouses had their own code, their own network of shared pain and useful information. "Everything okay?" Linda asked, trying to peer at Margaret's phone. "Just the lawyer. Some signature needed for the estate." Margaret tucked the phone away. "James called yesterday, actually. Wanted to know if I had your new address for some mail that got misdirected." Linda's fork paused midway to her mouth. "James? What did you tell him?" "Just that he should contact you directly." "Was that wrong?" No. It's just, we're trying to maintain distance. For healing purposes, Dr. Morrison says clean breaks are essential for moving forward." Moving forward, again. Linda's favorite phrase these days, as if life were a straight highway instead of a circular trap. They finished lunch with the usual rituals, splitting the check, though Linda's credit card was new, probably another gift from Robert, promises to text later, plans for next week's coffee. Linda hugged her goodbye, and Margaret inhaled that too-young perfume one more time, wondering if Robert came home smelling of it, if she'd simply never noticed. In her car, Margaret called James Chen. "Can you meet now?" His voice carried an urgency that matched her own. "Starbucks on Detroit Road? 20 minutes. Margaret drove past her house, Robert's car absent as expected for a Wednesday afternoon. He had client meetings every Wednesday now, had for 6 months. She'd thought business was booming. Instead, he was booming Linda. James Chen looked terrible, and that pleased Margaret more than it should have. His silver hair was unkempt, his usually perfect suit wrinkled. Divorce had aged him in dog years, while Linda bloomed on what Margaret now suspected was not settlement money, but Robert's redirected affection. "I could lose everything if she finds out I'm talking to you," he began without preamble. The NDA was very specific. "I'm not asking you to violate it," Margaret lied smoothly. Amazing how easy deception became with practice. "I'm just concerned about Linda. She seems different lately." James laughed bitterly. Different. That's one way to put it. He pulled out his phone, showed her a photo. "This was sent to me by accident 6 months ago. Linda meant to send it to someone else." The photo showed Linda in lingerie Margaret recognized. They'd shopped for it together at Victoria's Secret when Linda was reclaiming her sexuality. But the timestamp made Margaret's blood freeze. April 3rd. 11:47 p.m., the night of her mother's diagnosis, when Margaret had cried herself to sleep while Robert worked late on quarterly reports. "She was having an affair," James continued, "for months before she filed for divorce. I hired a private investigator, got evidence, but her lawyer threatened to destroy my business if I didn't sign the NDA and give her what she wanted. Said she'd claim abuse, manipulation, financial control, all lies. But who'd believe me? The sympathetic divorced woman or the bitter ex-husband?" "Do you know who it was? The affair partner?" James shook his head. "The PI lost him at some country club, members only, very discreet. But Linda called him her insurance policy in one text I saw, said he was worth more than money." Insurance policy. Robert's profession turned into a pet name. Margaret felt sick. "Why are you telling me this?" James met her eyes. "Because I heard Robert joined the country club 6 months ago, because Linda's been glowing lately, because you deserve to know what kind of friend you have." "What kind of friend?" Margaret repeated. "Yes, I'm learning that." She thanked James, promised his secret was safe, and drove home to her empty house. Whiskers greeted her at the door, meowing for his lunch. She fed him automatically, her mind processing this new information. The country club membership explained the missing money from their joint savings, $17,500 withdrawn in April for business expansion. The same month Linda's divorce finalized, the same month Mom got sick, the same month Margaret's world started its slow collapse that she was only now beginning to see. In Robert's home office, a room she rarely entered, dominated by his sales awards and that ridiculous barbecue trophy, Margaret began her real search. She'd been gathering digital evidence for weeks, but physical evidence had its own power. The desk drawers were locked, but Robert kept the key in an obviously fake rock in the garden because he was the kind of man who thought he was clever. Margaret retrieved it, mud from yesterday's rain still clinging to her house slippers. The first drawer held the expected business cards, old contracts, a flask she didn't know he owned. The second had office supplies and a box of condoms that made her laugh out loud. They hadn't had sex in 8 months. Robert claimed it was stress from work, maybe low testosterone, nothing personal. Now she knew he'd simply been saving himself for someone who wore cloud perfume and blue wrap dresses. The third drawer was locked separately. The fake rock key didn't work. Margaret studied the lock, remembering something from her nursing days when they'd had to secure medication cabinets. She found a paperclip, straightened it, and worked at the lock with the patience of someone with nothing left to lose. It opened. Inside were printed emails, hotel receipts, a jewelry store receipt for items never given to her. But what stopped her breathing was a legal document, preliminary divorce agreement, dated 2 weeks ago. Robert was already planning to leave her. With her mother's inheritance in hand, he'd file for divorce, claim abandonment, she'd been emotionally absent during her mother's illness, and take half of everything, including the money her mother had specifically left to secure her independence. Under the agreement was another document, power of attorney transfer. If Margaret became incapacitated by grief, Robert would control her inheritance. She photographed everything, her hands steady despite the earthquake in her chest. Then she saw the post-it note stuck to the back of the power of attorney in Linda's handwriting, Plan B if she doesn't agree to divorce quietly. Plan B, make Margaret seem crazy with grief, have her committed for evaluation, take control of her money. It had happened to Linda's own aunt. The family had her declared incompetent, took her house, left her in a state facility. Linda had cried telling that story, said it was criminal what families could do to vulnerable women. Now she was planning the same for Margaret. The front door opened downstairs. Robert's voice called out, "Margaret? You home?" She quickly closed the drawers, locked them, slipped the key in her pocket. By the time Robert reached the kitchen, she was making coffee, humming off-key, the picture of domestic normalcy. "You're home early," she said. "Client canceled. Thought we could have dinner together for once." For once. As if she hadn't cooked dinner for him 10,000 times over 30 years. As if she were the one with Wednesday afternoon client meetings. "That sounds nice. I'll defrost the chicken." He came up behind her, and for a horrible moment she thought he might embrace her. Instead, he reached around her for the coffee pot, his cologne, new, expensive, nothing like the Old Spice he'd worn for decades, overwhelming her senses. "Actually, I thought we could go out. That Italian place you like?" The Italian place was expensive. Robert only suggested it when he wanted something or felt guilty. Margaret wondered which this was. "What's the occasion?" "Can't a man take his wife to dinner?" His wife. Not my wife or the woman I love or even her name. Just his wife, like a possession, a title, a thing to be maintained while he planned his escape with her best friend. "Let me change," she said. Upstairs, she texted Diane, "Can you come visit next week? Need you here." The response was immediate. "Everything okay?" Number. But it will be. She changed into the black dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral, adding the pearl necklace Robert had given her for their 25th anniversary. Looking in the mirror, she saw her mother's face, the strong jaw, the determined eyes, the mouth that could smile through any pain. At dinner, Robert was unusually attentive. He ordered wine, the good kind, not the house red. He asked about her day, pretended to listen to her response. He even suggested dessert, though he'd been complaining about his weight for months. "The inheritance should clear next week," he said over tiramisu. "We should celebrate." "Maybe a trip?" Linda mentioned there's a couple's resort in Cabo that's supposed to be incredible. Linda mentioned. Of course she did. That sounds expensive. We can afford it now. With your mother's money, we can afford a lot of things. Your mother's money. Not her money. Not even their money. Your mother's money, like it was already spent in his mind. I was thinking of using some for improvements on the house. The kitchen needs updating. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Let's not make any big decisions yet. The financial advisor says we should invest most of it for retirement. Whose retirement, Robert? The question hung between them like a blade. He laughed, forced and hollow. Ours, of course. What a strange question. Is it? She met his eyes across the table, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw fear there. Then it was gone, replaced by the salesman's smooth charm that had worked on clients and church committees and lonely best friends looking for love. You've been under a lot of stress, he said carefully. Maybe you should talk to someone. A professional. Linda knows an excellent therapist. There it was. The first step in Plan B, plant the seeds of her instability. Linda's therapist was probably already briefed, ready to testify about Margaret's concerning behavior if needed. I have my grief counselor, but someone more comprehensive, someone who could really help you process everything. Process everything. like she was a computer that needed debugging, like grief was a software problem to be solved. "I'll think about it." He reached across the table, took her hand. His touch felt like spiders crawling on her skin. "I just want you to be happy, Margaret. That's all I've ever wanted." The lie was so bold, so complete, that Margaret almost admired it. This was the man who'd stood before God and family, promising to forsake all others. The man who'd held her hand through 3 pregnancies, 2 miscarriages, her mother's death. The man who'd been inside another woman while Margaret planned a funeral. "I know exactly what you want, Robert." He pulled his hand back. "What does that mean?" "Nothing. Just that I know you care." The waiter brought the check. Robert paid with the credit card that had also paid for Linda's tennis bracelet. Margaret watched him sign the receipt, noticed he'd started writing his signature differently, larger, more flourished, like he was practicing for a new life. At home, Robert settled into his recliner while Margaret cleaned up the kitchen that didn't need cleaning. She heard him on the phone, voice low, probably talking to Linda, probably reporting on the dinner, on Margaret's concerning behavior, on the success of Phase 1. Margaret pulled out her phone and opened the Note app where she'd been building her plan. Tomorrow was Thursday, the country club gala. Robert thought she'd be at grief counseling, crying into tissues while he and Linda played power couple for the hospital board. But Margaret had canceled grief counseling 2 weeks ago. Tomorrow, she'd be at the country club. Not as a member, she couldn't enter without one, but the catering company was always hiring extra hands for big events. She'd called yesterday, offered to help for free in exchange for learning the business for church events. They'd been thrilled. She'd be there in a server's uniform, invisible as she'd always been, watching her husband and best friend perform their charade, but more importantly, she'd be recording. The phone in her pocket had excellent video quality, and Michigan was a one-party consent state for recordings. She'd looked it up. The grandfather clock chimed 10. Robert was snoring in his chair. Margaret climbed the stairs to their bedroom, whiskers following. She lay down fully dressed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that still looked like a rabbit, or maybe now it looked like a wolf. Her phone buzzed. "Diane. Booked a flight. Landing Tuesday. Whatever's happening, we'll face it together." Margaret smiled in the dark. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, she'd stop being the victim in Robert and Linda's story. Tomorrow, she'd begin writing her own ending. The clock chimed 11, then midnight. Margaret didn't sleep. She lay there planning, preparing, transforming. By morning, the Margaret who'd baked pies and organized church fundraisers would be gone entirely. In her place would be someone far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and $175,000 to gain. Margaret adjusted the catering vest for the 3rd time, checking her reflection in the country club's service bathroom mirror. The uniform made her invisible, just another middle-aged woman serving drinks to people who wouldn't remember her face 5 minutes later. Perfect. The Westlake Reserve Country Club gleamed with the kind of aggressive luxury that whispered old money while screaming new debt. Margaret had arrived at 4 p.m. with the catering crew, blending in seamlessly with women who looked just like her, tired, practical, needing the work. None of them knew she had $175,000 waiting in probate and a husband plotting to steal it. "You're on champagne duty," the catering manager had said. "Just circulate, keep glasses full, don't speak unless spoken to." Don't speak unless spoken to. After 30 years of marriage, Margaret was an expert at that. Now, at 7 p.m., the gala was in full swing. She recognized half the faces, church members, Robert's clients, Linda's book club friends who'd dropped Margaret after choosing sides in the divorce. They looked right through her as she offered champagne, their conversations flowing around her like she was furniture. Then she saw them. Robert entered first, his good navy suit pressed perfectly. Margaret had ironed it yesterday, habit overcoming irony. Linda followed, wearing the blue dress, of course. But there was something else, something that made Margaret's grip tighten on the champagne tray. Linda was wearing her mother's brooch. The sapphire and diamond pin had gone missing from Margaret's jewelry box 2 weeks ago. She'd torn the house apart looking for it, that last piece of her mother she could hold. Robert had suggested she'd misplaced it in her grief, that maybe she should see that therapist Linda recommended. Now it gleamed on Linda's dress like a confession. Margaret forced herself to breathe, to move, to offer champagne to a couple she didn't recognize. Her phone, tucked in her vest pocket, was already recording. She'd started it in the bathroom, the camera lens barely visible through a hole she'd cut in the fabric. "Margaret?" She turned. James Chen stood there, looking as surprised as she felt. "James, I didn't expect. I'm on the hospital board. Had to come." His eyes tracked to Linda across the room. "I didn't know she'd be here." "She's co-chairing with Robert." James's face darkened. "Of course she is." He took a champagne glass from her tray, lowered his voice. "Why are you serving drinks?" "Research," Margaret said simply. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Do you need help?" "Just stay out of my way." She moved on, circulating closer to where Robert and Linda held court. They stood near the silent auction tables, Robert's hand resting on Linda's lower back with a familiarity that should have been suspicious to anyone watching. But nobody was watching. That was the thing about affairs. People saw what they expected to see. "A inheritance finally cleared," Robert was saying to Harold Morrison from the Rotary Club. "Margaret's mother left her quite comfortable. We're planning to invest most of it, maybe take a nice vacation." "Good for you," Harold replied. "And Linda, you're looking radiant as always. Divorce suits you." Linda laughed, that tinkling sound Margaret now recognized as performance. "Oh, Harold, you charmer. But really, I've just been fortunate to have such supportive friends." She touched Robert's arm. "I don't know what I'd do without this one." Margaret approached with her tray. "Champagne?" Robert took a glass without looking at her. Linda did look, their eyes meeting for one electric second before Linda's widened in shock. Margaret smiled pleasantly, offering nothing more than a server's bland expression, and moved on, but she stayed within earshot. "Was that?" Linda started. "Was that what?" Robert asked. "Nothing. I thought I recognized. Never mind." Margaret circulated, always keeping them in peripheral vision, her phone capturing everything. At 8 p.m., dinner was announced. She watched Robert and Linda take their seats at the head table, Linda's hand briefly covering Robert's on the white tablecloth. During the salad course, Margaret heard her name. "Where is Margaret tonight?" "Dr. Morrison, the therapist Linda had recommended," asked Robert. "I was hoping to meet her." "Linda speaks so highly of her." "She's at grief counseling," Robert replied smoothly. "Still working through her mother's death?" "It's been very hard on her." 6 months is a significant period, Dr. Morrison said. "Has she shown any concerning behaviors?" "Depression can manifest in unexpected ways." "Well," Robert began, and Margaret moved closer, refilling water glasses at the adjacent table. "She's been paranoid lately." "Accusatory, claiming things are missing when she's clearly misplaced them. Last week she accused me of taking money from our savings when she'd simply forgotten about a check she'd written." Lies. All lies. But Dr. Morrison was nodding, making mental notes that would later become professional opinions if needed. "And she's been isolating," Linda added. "Canceling our coffee dates, not returning calls." "I'm worried about her." Margaret wanted to laugh. She wanted to scream. She wanted to dump the entire water pitcher over Linda's perfectly styled hair. Instead, she moved to the next table, steady as a surgeon. At 9 p.m., the speeches began. Robert took the podium, talking about the importance of community support, of helping those in need. Margaret recorded it all, including the moment when Linda wiped away what might have been a tear as Robert spoke about the angels among us who dedicate themselves to others. Then Robert said something that changed everything. "I want to make a special announcement. Tonight I'm pledging $50,000 to the Children's Hospital Building Fund." Applause erupted. Linda beamed. Harold Morrison shook Robert's hand. $50,000, money they didn't have unless... "The donation will be made as soon as my wife's inheritance clears next week," Robert continued. "Her mother would have wanted the money to help children in need." Margaret's mother, who'd never mentioned the hospital in her life. Margaret's mother, who'd specifically left the money to secure her daughter's independence. Margaret's mother, whose body wasn't even cold before Robert started spending her money. The phone in Margaret's pocket vibrated. A text from Diane. Landed early. At your house. Where are you? Robert said you were at counseling, but I called and they said you canceled weeks ago. Margaret typed back quickly. Country club. Don't let Robert know you're there. Hide your car. Trust me. She looked up to find Linda walking toward the service area. Margaret turned, but not quickly enough. Margaret, Linda's voice was ice. What are you doing here? Working. Margaret faced her former friend. The church needs experienced event servers. I'm learning. Linda's eyes dropped to the brooch on her dress, Margaret's mother's brooch, and her hand covered it instinctively. You should be at counseling. Should I? Robert's worried about you. We all are. We, such a small word to hold such enormous betrayal. That's touching, Linda. By the way, that's a beautiful brooch. Color drained from Linda's face. This? I bought it. Last week. At an estate sale. Really? Which one? I don't remember. Funny. It looks exactly like my mother's. The one that went missing from my jewelry box. Linda's voice hardened. You're confused, Margaret. Grief can make people see things that aren't there. Robert's right. You need help. What else has Robert told you I need? For a moment the mask slipped, and Margaret saw the real Linda. Calculating, predatory, nothing like the friend who'd held her hand through labor, who'd cried at her children's graduations, who'd sworn they'd be friends until they were old and gray in nursing homes together. He told me, Linda said quietly, that you're becoming a danger to yourself, that you might need to be evaluated, for your own safety. How convenient. And I suppose you'd comfort him through such a difficult time. Someone has to. Linda stepped closer. You've let yourself go, Margaret. You've given up. Robert deserves better. You're right, Margaret said. He does deserve better. He deserves exactly what he's going to get. Before Linda could respond, Margaret walked away, returning to her service station. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. She had enough evidence now. More than enough. At 10 p.m., as the gala wound down, Margaret made her move. She approached the AV technician who'd been running the slideshow of hospital photos on the large screens around the ballroom. Excuse me, she said, pulling out a USB drive. Mr. Hayes asked me to give you this. It's a surprise video tribute for the donors. The technician, barely out of college and eager to please, took the drive. When should I play it? He'll give you a signal during his closing remarks. Margaret retreated to the back of the room. Robert had returned to the podium for final thanks. Linda stood beside him, every inch the devoted co-chair. The perfect couple they'd never actually been. Before we end this wonderful evening, Robert began, I want to thank everyone who made this possible. The hospital board, the donors, and especially my co-chair, Linda Chen, whose tireless dedication. Margaret nodded to the technician. The screens flickered, the hospital slideshow vanished, replaced by a different kind of photo collection. Screenshots of text messages filled the screens. Robert's messages to Linda, explicit and unmistakable. Can't wait to taste you again. Margaret's at her mother's. Come over. The divorce lawyer says we need to wait until the inheritance clears. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Robert's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Linda grabbed his arm. But Margaret wasn't done. The images kept coming. Hotel receipts, the credit card charges for Linda's jewelry, the draft divorce agreement, the power of attorney papers with Linda's sticky note about Plan B. Then came the audio. Margaret had recorded Robert and Linda's conversation from earlier, their lies about her mental state, their plans to have her evaluated, their casual cruelty in discussing her like she was already gone. Turn it off! Robert shouted to the technician, who was frantically pressing buttons. I can't! It's not responding! Of course it wasn't. Margaret had made sure of that. The presentation would run its full 5 minutes, exactly as long as Robert's original speech about community and trust and helping those in need. The final image appeared: Robert and Linda kissing in the parking lot, taken by the security camera Margaret had asked the young valet to check for a lost earring earlier that evening. Silence fell like a hammer. Then Harold Morrison said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Robert, I think we need to reconsider that donation." The room erupted. Board members demanded explanations. Church friends turned away in disgust. James Chen laughed, actually laughed, raising his champagne glass to Margaret across the room. Robert pushed through the crowd toward her. "You crazy bitch, you've ruined everything." "No, Robert. You ruined everything 6 months ago when you decided my mother's death was your opportunity." Linda appeared behind him, her face streaked with mascara. "How could you do this to us?" "To you?" Margaret pulled out her phone, displaying one final photo, the receipt for Linda's dress from Nordstrom, paid for with Margaret's emergency credit card, the one Robert had used while she was at the hospital with her dying mother. "You mean, how could I do this to the woman who stole my husband while wearing my money?" People were recording now, phones out, the scandal too delicious to miss. Tomorrow, it would be all over Cleveland's social media. Robert's insurance agency, built on trust and reputation, would crumble. Linda's position in society, carefully cultivated post-divorce, would evaporate. "The inheritance," Robert said desperately. "You can't. It's marital property. I'll sue." "Actually," said a voice from the doorway, "she can." Everyone turned. A woman in a severe black suit entered, accompanied by 2 security guards and Diane, who must have broken several traffic laws to get there. "I'm Catherine Williams from Williams & Associates," the woman announced. "I represent Margaret Hayes. Mr. Hayes, you've been served." She handed him an envelope. "Divorce papers, citing adultery with extensive documentation. Ohio is an at-fault state, as you know. Additionally, there's a restraining order preventing you from accessing any of Mrs. Hayes's inheritance, which, according to her mother's will, is explicitly protected as separate property." She turned to Linda. "Ms. Chen, you've also been served. Alienation of affection. It's an old law, but still valid in Ohio. The damages we're seeking should just about match that generous divorce settlement you received." Linda's legs gave out. She collapsed into a chair, the stolen brooch glittering under the ballroom lights. "Additionally," the lawyer continued, "I believe the police will want to discuss the theft of a valuable piece of jewelry." She nodded to the security guards. "That brooch Ms. Chen is wearing was reported stolen this afternoon." The security guards moved toward Linda, who frantically unpinned the brooch, throwing it on the table like it burned her. "He gave it to me. Robert gave it to me." "From my jewelry box," Margaret said calmly, "which makes you both thieves as well as adulterers." The room was in chaos, people fleeing, others craning for a better view, phones recording everything. But Margaret felt perfectly still, like the eye of a hurricane she'd created. Robert's face was purple. "You'll get nothing. I'll fight this. You'll move out of my house by tomorrow," Margaret interrupted. "Your things will be in the garage." "Don't try to come inside. I've changed the locks." "You can't." "I can. Diane's staying with me, and her husband flew up this evening. He's a retired cop, remember? He's at the house now, making sure you didn't try to hide any assets." Margaret smiled. "Oh, and Robert?" "Your mother's grandfather clock stays. It was a wedding gift to both of us, but since you've abandoned the wedding, you've abandoned the clock." She turned to go, then remembered one more thing. "Dr. Morrison?" "I recorded our conversation earlier about my supposed mental health issues. I'm sure the medical board would be very interested in a therapist diagnosing someone he's never met based on the word of that patient's husband's mistress. Something to think about." Margaret walked out of the ballroom, her sister at her side, leaving devastation in her wake. Behind her, she heard Harold Morrison say, "I motion to remove Robert Hayes from the hospital board, effective immediately." "Seconded," called multiple voices. In the parking lot, Diane hugged her tight. Mom would be so proud. "She knew," Margaret said. Somehow she knew I'd need that money for exactly this. They drove home in Diane's rental car, leaving Margaret's Camry for tomorrow. The house felt different when they entered, lighter somehow, like an evil spirit had been exorcised. Robert's things were already gone from the bedroom, packed by Diane's husband Tom with military efficiency. The wedding photos remained, but Margaret would deal with those tomorrow. Tonight, she just wanted to sleep in her own bed without the sound of snoring beside her. Her phone buzzed all evening, messages from church friends, Robert's clients, reporters who'd somehow gotten her number. She ignored them all except one, from James Chen. That was magnificent. Linda's ex-friends are already calling me. Seems she borrowed money from half of them. Thank you for the best night I've had in years. At midnight, Margaret stood in her kitchen, the one Robert said didn't need updating, the one where she'd discovered his betrayal exactly 10 weeks ago. She opened a bottle of wine, the good stuff Robert had been saving for a special occasion. This seemed special enough. Diane joined her, and they toasted in the quiet kitchen. "What will you do now?" Diane asked. "First, I'm updating this kitchen. Then maybe I'll take that trip to Italy I always wanted. Alone." "And Robert?" "Robert will do what Robert does, find another woman to manipulate, but she won't be my friend, and she won't get my mother's money." Her phone rang, Robert's number. She declined the call, then blocked it. Then she blocked Linda's number, too. 30 years of friendship, 30 years of marriage, ended with 2 simple clicks. "Any regrets?" Diane asked. Margaret thought about it, about the young nurse who'd met a charming insurance salesman at a church potluck, about the hopeful bride who'd believed in forever, about the tired wife who'd spent decades shrinking herself to fit into Robert's shadow. "No," she said, "no regrets." Whiskers jumped onto the counter, purring loudly. Margaret scratched behind his ears, looking at the spot where Robert's iPad had revealed the truth. The grandfather clock chimed once. December 8th had begun. In a few hours the sunrise would light up her kitchen, in her house, paid for with her money, filled with her choices. For the first time in 30 years, Margaret Hayes was free, and revenge, it turned out, tasted better than any apple pie she'd ever baked. Epilogue, 6 months later. Margaret signed the final papers with a steady hand. The insurance agency was bankrupt. Robert's clients had fled after the scandal, taking their policies to competitors who hadn't publicly humiliated their wives. The house sale had closed yesterday. Robert got his half, just enough to cover his debts and Linda's lawsuit against him for misrepresentation of assets. Linda had moved to California to live with her daughter, her social media accounts deleted, her country club membership revoked after 3 other members came forward about missing jewelry. Margaret kept her mother's inheritance intact, every penny protected by the prenup she'd insisted on before their marriage, one detail Robert had forgotten about in his arrogance, buried in papers from 30 years ago. She looked around her new apartment, smaller but entirely hers, with a renovated kitchen and a view of Lake Erie. The grandfather clock stood in the corner, keeping perfect time. Her phone rang. James Chen. "Coffee?" he asked. "I found this great place that makes terrible sandwiches but excellent conversation." Margaret smiled. "Give me 20 minutes." She hung up, gave Whiskers a treat, and grabbed her keys. Outside, spring was beginning in Cleveland, crocuses pushing through the last snow. Her mother had been right. The inheritance had secured her independence, but Margaret had secured her dignity all by herself.